This is the Audient iD4, and even though it's several years old now, it's probably still my favorite USB audio interface at its price point. But they've recently released this similarly spec'd EVO 4 at a serious price reduction, so today we're going to see which is the better buy in 2020. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and this color is not a mistake. I did it on purpose. So I'd like to give a little disclaimer here. This video is not sponsored, and I don't fancy myself an audiophile or an audio professional. I'm just an enthusiast end user who has specific needs for my audio hardware, and so I'd like to just share my experiences, and if you're anything like me, hopefully this will be useful to you. When it comes to recording dialogue in my studio or on location, I typically use a portable recorder, like the Zoom F6, and in a previous video I even demonstrated how I was able to use that Zoom as my audio interface. But I don't like disconnecting everything each time I take it with me to record, so I like a more permanent interface installation. In the budget realms, I usually recommended Steinberg or Focusrite for that function, but if you have a little more cash, I thought Audient was the way to go. Their preamps and converters sound fantastic, and they also feature better headphone amplifiers than those budget interfaces to drive your heavier cans. But the Audient line starts at $199 with the iD4, which might be cost prohibitive for some people. Well, now Audient has the EVO 4, which is only $129 and more in line price-wise with those budget interfaces. And best of all, from my testing, it sounds pretty much the same as the iD and keeps all the same functionality, including the excellent headphone amplifier. To compare the audio quality, I put each interface through my battery of use cases. Typically, I use them with a single microphone for live streaming, conference calls, or recording tutorials at my desk, and I occasionally plug in a guitar or keyboard to track some music or apply real-time effects. So here's some comparisons of all three of those situations. For the microphone, I used an Octava MK12 into the XLR input with phantom power on. For the keyboard, I used the same input, but the TRS component of the combo jack and set it to line level. And then for the guitar, I use the DI input on the front, which, as Audient claims, is a harmonically rich JFET input designed to replicate the input stage of a classic valve amplifier. Here's the samples. In the 1980s, Banner once again gained control over the Hulk, and gained amnesty for his past rampages. However, due to the manipulations of the supernatural character Nightmare, Banner eventually lost control over the Hulk. In the 1980s, Banner once again gained control over the Hulk, and gained amnesty for his past rampages. However, due to the manipulations of the supernatural character Nightmare, Banner eventually lost control over the Hulk. Now, no processing was applied to those recordings, but I also included a moment of silence during each of those tests and then normalized the recordings to the same level and tested the noise performance of them, and it ranged from -69 dB to -75 dB during the quiet parts, which is excellent and was similar on both devices, but the EVO 4 did typically beat the iD4 by about 2 to 3% when the gain was high. In terms of the actual sound quality, it's a bit more subjective, and I'm betting that if you listen to them on anything but a decent pair of headphones, you probably didn't hear a difference. My personal take, using my DT770s, is that for the talking vocal, they were identical, save for maybe a little more compression on the iD4. The guitar sounded a touch better on the iD4 to my ears. It seemed a little warmer and smoother during the sustain notes, and the piano was pretty much the same in terms of tone, but the iD4 seemed to offer a touch better separation between the lows and the highs. but that's me being really picky, and I'd say each of those differences is less than 5%. But let me know in the comments which you thought sounded better, or if you could even hear a difference. If you read over the spec pages, it would seem that they've made some minor improvements to the hardware on the EVO. They trade blows, but the EVO 4 wins in several categories. But in my experience, the numbers aren't everything when it comes to what sounds good to your ears. But I'll include links to each spec page in the description below if you want to compare the values. To get more information about the preamps used in the EVO 4, I reached out to the technical manager at Audient, who said that the iD4 uses the same console preamps they use on all the iD range, as well as their flagship recording console, which are meant to be fast, clean, and neutral preamps that can add a bit more weight if you start to push them. The EVO 4, on the other hand, uses a newly developed preamp design which allows them to be digitally controlled. This allows them to include features like smart gain and stereo grouping. According to Audient, both use similar converters, and the monitor outputs and headphone amps are pretty much the same on both units. The stereo grouping function is quite useful though, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But my advice when it comes to sound quality is that they're close enough to suggest buying whichever is cheaper, which in this case is the EVO 4. So instead it's going to have to come down to form and functionality. You can tell the EVO 4 is cheaper because it's made of plastic, where the iD4 is encased in metal. It's a strong plastic, but it does have some give to it, and if you squeeze it you can make it click and pop and separate a little, which I don't love. But of course, if it's just sitting on your desk, this won't matter. There are some differences in the ports though. The iD4 only has one XLR input, which is a combo jack with phantom power, and then input 2 is the instrument input on the front. The EVO 4 has two combo jacks on the back, both allowing for 48-volt phantom power, and then the instrument input on the front, which overrides one of the rear ports when used, so it still only has a total of two inputs, but more flexibility in the device type as you can use two XLR mics versus only one on the iD4. Both have balanced TRS outputs and a USB port, but the EVO 4's port is USB-C, where the iD4 is starting to show its age here with a full-size Type-B port. On the front though, the iD4 pulls ahead with two headphone jacks, one at 1/4 inch and one at 3.5mm, both of which can run simultaneously without reducing the volume of the other, and which can run at the same time as the balanced outs. The EVO 4 only has the one 1/4 inch headphone output, and it mutes the balanced outs when connected. I prefer the iD4 here, which has a separate mute button, which you can use to only mute the balanced outputs, giving you more control over how you route your sound. The iD4 also features dedicated knobs for the gain of each input, your input DAW mix, and your master volume. The EVO 4 does this differently with only a single knob that changes its function depending on the button you press last. So if you press 1 and then turn the knob, you're adjusting the gain of input 1. Then if you press the mix button, now you're adjusting your DAW mix. And then if you press the levels button, now you'll be adjusting your volume. It works fine, but I definitely prefer the dedicated knobs on the iD4. However, the iD4's volume knob seems to have a larger dead zone on it, which makes the EVO 4 feel a bit more responsive. And of course, these differences change the overall cosmetics of the units, and perhaps you'd prefer the more modern look of the EVO instead of the more classic hi-fi vibes of the iD. There is one limitation in the design of the EVO though, and that has to do with the metering. On the iD4, the lights are color-coded. They go green, yellow, and then red, and there's indicators of -36, -18, -12, -6, and then 0, so you have a better sense of your levels. On the EVO, it's just a series of lights that go around in a circle around the volume knob, and they don't really give you much of a sense of how your levels are set. The only thing you can really get from this is whether you're clipping, which is determined by if the lights fill all the way up. But it would have been better, in my opinion, if they would have either color-coded the lights or included a numerical guide alongside them. Each device also has a unique button. On the iD4, it's a function button that allows you to press it and then use the volume knob as a scroll wheel on your computer, which is actually kind of handy for certain applications. On the EVO 4, it's a smart gain button that you can use to set the gain levels automatically. Now, while I could see the argument for this providing some time savings or perhaps helping beginners, it's not something I would ever use, as I prefer to set my gain manually. Software-wise, they use pretty identical ASIO drivers, allowing up to 96 kHz at 24-bit, with a minimum round-trip monitoring latency of 4.1 milliseconds on the EVO 4 and 4.55 milliseconds on the iD4. So pretty much identical results. One interesting quirk though is that the drivers overwrite each other on install and use a different config panel, so you can't actually configure them both at the same time on the same computer, which made my testing a bit more tedious but shouldn't affect the average user much. Generally, you're better off getting a larger interface with more inputs and outputs than connecting multiple interfaces. Otherwise, you run the risk of introducing driver conflicts and software problems. The EVO 4 does have a couple advantages though on the software side. One, it has a loopback function, so you can take the audio that you're listening to to through the device, like a song or a backing track, and loop that back into your DAW as its own track to record it and play along with it. And this doesn't count against your total input usage, so it's an optional third track for the loopback. The iD4 does not have this feature. Also, getting back to that stereo grouping thing, the EVO 4 installs all of its inputs as separate devices instead of a combo driver like on the iD4. This means that you can enable your typical left-right stereo pair as your device in the OS, or you can choose just a mono input or output. This has advantages in programs like OBS that tend to treat everything as stereo and use pan law to decrease your output to an unwanted -6 dB when down mixing to mono in the program. While with the separated inputs on the EVO driver, you can choose a mono input in OBS, which is not subject to the same down mixing issue and is loaded as a proper mono device. There is a workaround for this with the iD4, which is to install the ASIO plugin for OBS, and then you can separate your inputs in the same way. But out of the box, this is an advantage to the EVO 4 if you use OBS a lot. Overall, there's really only two reasons to not get the EVO 4 and save the $70. First, if you prefer the look and design of the iD4, because I do find it a bit more logically laid out and don't love the plastic on the EVO, or if you need that extra headphone jack without muting your line outs. The sound quality is slightly better on the iD4 in my opinion, but I don't think it's $70 better. But if you're okay with the design and audio routing on the EVO 4, then it's a no-brainer. It's $70 less, comes with an extra XLR input, loopback, and more versatile drivers. For my personal needs, I still prefer the iD4, and luckily both options are still going to be available as I'm told the iD4 isn't being replaced. So now you'll have two fantastic options, both offering probably the best sound quality you can get at their respective price points. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video entertaining, or at least helpful, and if you did, make sure to leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, try setting the playback speed to 75%. Yeah, alright. I'm done.